England, 1215. A kingdom that once prided itself on order and divine rule now trembles on the edge of collapse. The crown still rests on a king's head, but its authority is cracking. Across the countryside, banners rise not against a foreign invader, but against the very man sworn to protect the realm. This is not conquest, this is rebellion. The land is heavy with fear and anger. Castles lock their gates. Roads, once used by merchants, now carry armed men. Noble lords, bound by oath and blood to their king, begin to choose sides, knowing there is no turning back. To oppose the crown is treason. To obey it may be ruin. At the center of the storm stands King John, ruler of England, heir of the mighty Plantagenets. To his enemies, he is a tyrant. To his allies, a liability. To his people, a distant shadow whose demands grow harsher with every passing year. What begins as resistance will soon become something far more dangerous: England's first civil war, a conflict that will redraw the balance of power forever. Before Parliament, before constitutional law, before the idea that even a king must answer to his people, there was blood, steel, and a kingdom at war with itself. In June of 1215, on a quiet meadow beside the River Thames at Runnymede, England's fate appeared to change with the stroke of a pen. King John, surrounded by armed barons, pressed his royal seal into a document that would echo through centuries: Magna Carta, the Great Charter. To later generations, it would become a symbol of liberty and law. But in that moment, it was something far more fragile, a ceasefire born of fear. The Charter promised limits on royal power. It spoke of justice not sold, delayed, or denied. It declared that even a king must obey the law. Yet beneath the formal language lay deep mistrust. John did not sign Magna Carta in good faith. He signed because he had no army strong enough to refuse. The barons, too, were uneasy. They had forced concessions from the crown, but they knew how easily promises could be broken. The ink was barely dry before both sides began preparing for the next move. Peace, if it could be called that, rested on a foundation already cracking. To King John, Magna Carta was an insult, a humiliation imposed at sword point. Almost immediately, he sought a way out. Messengers rode to Rome, carrying pleas to Pope Innocent III, arguing that the charter violated the sacred authority of a divinely appointed king. If the Pope ruled in John's favor, Magna Carta could be erased with a single declaration. For the barons, Magna Carta was not an ending, but a beginning. It proved the king could be challenged. It proved unity could force change. And if the charter failed, they were prepared to go further. Runnymede did not end the conflict. It only cast a long shadow over England, one filled with broken oaths, looming violence, and the realization that words on parchment mean nothing without the will to defend them. The road to civil war was already unfolding. King John wore the crown of England, but he never truly possessed the loyalty that should have come with it. From the moment he inherited the throne in 1199, suspicion followed him like a shadow. He was not the heroic warrior his brother Richard the Lionheart had been, nor did he command natural respect. Instead, John ruled through fear, manipulation, and constant mistrust, even of those closest to him. Among the barons, his reputation was toxic. John demanded relentless taxes to fund wars he repeatedly lost. Lands in France, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine slipped from English control, shattering the prestige of the Plantagenet dynasty. To many nobles, these defeats were unforgivable. They had paid dearly in gold and blood, only to watch their king fail again and again. Worse still was John's temperament. He was vindictive, quick to punish and slow to forgive. Noble families were fined into ruin for minor offenses. He seized hostages to enforce loyalty, imprisoning sons and heirs as leverage. Justice under John became arbitrary, dependent not on law, but on the king's mood and need for money. Even the church was not spared. When John clashed with the Pope over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, England was placed under interdict. Churches closed, bells fell silent, the dead went unburied in consecrated ground. To many, it felt as though God himself had turned away from the king. By 1215, John was a ruler without trust. His barons doubted his word, his people feared his rule, and his enemies sensed weakness. A crown once seen as sacred now looked fragile, held not by loyalty but by force. In medieval England, kingship depended on mutual obligation. John broke that balance, and when trust dies between a king and his nobles, rebellion becomes not only possible, but inevitable. The road to rebellion was paved not only with anger, but with defeat. For years, King John had promised glory across the Channel, victory in France, restored lands, and the revival of his family's honor. Instead, he delivered humiliation. One by one, the great territories once ruled by his father Henry II were lost. Normandy fell in 1204. Anjou and Maine soon followed. England's continental empire collapsed, and with it, the confidence of the nobility. These were not distant losses. For many English barons, France was home. Their castles, incomes, and ancestral lands lay on both sides of the Channel. When John failed to defend them, entire families were ruined overnight. Titles remained, but wealth and influence vanished. To the barons, the king had not merely failed, he had abandoned them. Determined to reclaim what was lost, John prepared for war again and again. Each campaign demanded vast sums of money. Taxes were raised relentlessly. Feudal dues were inflated beyond custom. Scutage, payments made in place of military service, became a weapon imposed repeatedly and mercilessly. Even loyal lords began to feel squeezed dry. Then came the final disaster. In 1214, John launched a grand campaign to retake Normandy, coordinating with allies across Europe. The plan collapsed at the Battle of Bouvines, where John's forces were decisively defeated. The dream of reconquest died on the battlefield, along with what remained of John's credibility. The consequences were devastating. England had paid the price for wars it never won. Nobles were poorer, soldiers were dead, and the king returned home empty-handed, yet still demanding more. Failure in war stripped John of honor, authority, and trust. The barons had financed his ambitions, endured his demands, and sacrificed their fortunes. Now they faced a bitter truth. As long as John ruled unchecked, England would continue to bleed. By 1214, England's nobles had endured years of humiliation, financial ruin, and broken promises. King John's repeated failures in France, his harsh taxation, and his unpredictable temper had pushed even the most loyal barons to the edge. The tipping point was no single act. It was a relentless accumulation of grievances that left the nobility feeling trapped and powerless under a crown that ruled by fear rather than law. The barons' frustration took shape in whispered meetings behind castle walls. In great halls and candlelit chambers, they shared stories of lost lands, unpaid debts, and sons imprisoned for disobedience. Every conversation carried a dangerous question. Could they continue to obey a king who disregarded justice and threatened their livelihoods, or was rebellion now their only choice? Loyalty, once sacred, was eroding. John's cruelty had reached far beyond taxation. He exploited feuds between noble families, playing them against each other to consolidate power. He seized estates under pretext, demanded hostages, and punished those who questioned his authority. The barons, once united under the banner of feudal duty, found themselves increasingly alienated, humiliated, and enraged. By the spring of 1215, the barons' breaking point arrived. They began to draft a list of demands, principles that would limit the king's authority, protect their lands, and guarantee fair justice. These demands were bold and unprecedented. For the first time in English history, the nobility sought not merely compensation, but a formal declaration that the king himself must obey the law. What began as private frustration was transforming into organized defiance. Alliances formed, oaths were sworn, and plans for enforcement were drawn. The barons understood that challenging a king carried immense risk. Treason could mean death, but the cost of silence had grown far greater. England teetered on the edge, and the storm of civil war was about to break. In the quiet of night, away from the eyes of the crown, England's barons took a bold and dangerous step. They swore secret oaths of defiance against their own king, pledging to enforce limits on his power by any means necessary. These were not idle promises, they were binding commitments forged in blood, fear, and desperate hope. The oaths of defiance marked a turning point. Rebellion was no longer a thought, it had become a pact. The barons met in hidden chambers, in remote castles, and among the ancient woods of England. Each man swore to uphold their collective demands: fair taxation, protection of property, and obedience to the law even by the king himself. The oaths were solemn, often invoking God as witness, for the penalty of breaking them was grave, not only earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. Loyalty to John, once a sacred duty, was now questioned openly. These secret agreements were more than mere words. They were a blueprint for organized resistance. Letters were sent, messengers carried the barons' intentions across counties, and alliances solidified. Nobles who had once been rivals found common cause. In these oaths, personal grievances merged into a shared vision, a kingdom where power could be checked and tyranny held accountable. For King John, if he had known, the oaths would have seemed a dagger in the dark. They were invisible, yet deadly, signaling that the barons would act in unison, coordinated and relentless. The seeds of civil war were sown not in open battle, but in the quiet resolve of men bound by oath, willing to challenge a king himself. England stood on the precipice. These oaths were not simply about rebellion, they were about reshaping the very notion of kingship. And when the storm broke, the consequences would be felt across every shire, castle, and town in the realm. The king would soon learn that loyalty cannot be demanded, it must be earned. On a summer day in June 1215, the lush meadow of Runnymede beside the Thames became the stage for a tense and uneasy peace. King John, the most feared monarch in England, faced a united front of rebellious barons. In an extraordinary act under the shadow of threat, he affixed his seal to the Magna Carta, a document that promised to limit his power and protect the rights of his subjects. But the peace forged at Runnymede was built not on trust or goodwill. It was a peace born of fear. For John, the charter was a humiliation. He had been cornered by men he considered inferior in loyalty and strength. forced to grant concessions he would never have given voluntarily. The king's pride and temper bristled, yet the threat of armed rebellion left him no choice. Every clause, every phrase was a reminder that his authority could be challenged and that defiance might spread like wildfire. For the barons, Runnymede was both victory and precaution. They had forced the king to acknowledge their demands, but they knew that John's temper and cunning could render the agreement meaningless. The seals and signatures on the parchment were fragile shields against the returning storm of royal vengeance. Secret discussions continued, oaths were sworn, and plans were laid for enforcement. This was a peace that could shatter at any misstep. The people of England watched cautiously. For peasants and townsfolk, the charter promised little immediate relief, yet it signaled a seismic shift. The king was no longer absolute, and even the highest lord could demand accountability. Runnymede was a pause in the gathering storm, a temporary calm that masked the growing tension beneath the surface. In the weeks and months that followed, it became clear that this peace was a fragile illusion. Fear, not trust, held it together. The road to civil war, marked by mistrust, betrayal, and ambition, had only just begun. England stood at the edge of a conflict that would shape the nation for centuries. The ink on Magna Carta had barely dried when King John began plotting his revenge. To him, the charter was not a milestone of justice. It was an insult, a symbol of humiliation forced upon him by rebellious barons. His pride, already bruised by years of failed campaigns in France, would not allow him to accept limitations on his power. In the dark corridors of his castles, John whispered of retribution, gathering allies who remained loyal to the crown and scheming against those who dared defy him. John's first move was diplomatic. He sent urgent letters to Pope Innocent III, appealing to the authority of the Church. He framed Magna Carta as a threat to divine order, arguing that no king, chosen by God, could be bound by a document forced under coercion. The Pope agreed, declaring the charter null and void, and placing the rebellious barons under excommunication. In an instant, John transformed a fragile legal compromise into a moral justification for war. But John did not stop at words. He began preparing his armies, mobilizing knights, mercenaries, and loyal forces to strike back at the barons' castles. Castles that had felt secure under Magna Carta were suddenly vulnerable. Roads and rivers became channels for troop movements, and villages near royal strongholds were threatened with violence if the lords resisted. Rebellion, once a political maneuver, was now a matter of survival. John's message was clear. Defiance would be met with swift and merciless punishment. He combined legal cunning, spiritual authority, and military might to reclaim control, signaling that the crown would not tolerate dissent. England watched anxiously as the fragile peace of Runnymede dissolved. The king's revenge had begun, and what followed would be a brutal, chaotic struggle that pitted neighbor against neighbor, baron against baron, and ultimately set the stage for the first true civil war in English history. The seeds of bloodshed were sown. With Pope Innocent III's intervention, the fragile peace of Runnymede shattered almost immediately. King John had appealed to the Church, framing Magna Carta as an affront to divine authority, and the Pope responded decisively. The charter was annulled, and the rebellious barons were excommunicated. What was meant as a spiritual condemnation became a spark for political chaos, throwing England into uncertainty and unrest. Excommunication carried immense weight in medieval society. Those under its shadow were cut off from the sacraments, denied Christian burial, and considered outside the protection of God. For the barons, this was a terrifying weapon, yet it did not quell their rebellion. Instead, it emboldened them, confirming that the king would stop at nothing to maintain power, and that the church could be wielded as a political tool. The moral authority of the crown clashed violently with the practical ambitions of the nobility. Across the kingdom, chaos began to spread. Lords fortified castles, hoarded supplies, and raised private armies. Peasants and townspeople, caught between opposing forces, fled villages or prepared to defend their homes. Roads became dangerous, and trade slowed as law and order weakened. Each day brought skirmishes, sieges, and the threat of famine, signaling that England was descending into civil war. Even loyal knights faced difficult choices. Allegiance to the king, to the church, or to local lords became a matter of survival, not honor. Friends became enemies, families divided along lines of loyalty and principle. The very fabric of society strained under the weight of fear and suspicion. By excommunicating the barons, John and the Pope had hoped to restore obedience. Instead, they accelerated the collapse of trust and order. England teetered on the edge of total war. What began as political dissent had transformed into chaos as the kingdom faced a conflict that would pit crown against nobility and plunge the land into one of its darkest chapters. England in 1215 was no longer a unified kingdom. It had fractured into rival territories, each loyal to different leaders and ideals. The fragile peace of Runnymede had collapsed, and with John asserting his authority while the barons resisted, the country split along lines of loyalty, fear, and ambition. Castles and towns became symbols of allegiance, their banners signaling whose side each lord had chosen. In the north, castles held by royalist forces prepared for sieges, stockpiling food, weapons, and men. Their lords swore loyalty to John, believing that obedience would protect their lands and families. Meanwhile, in the south and Midlands, rebel barons fortified their strongholds, ready to resist attacks with whatever force they could muster. Between these territories lay contested lands, villages caught in the middle, and roads that became perilous corridors where armed patrols and raiders prowled. The division was not just physical, but political. John commanded the backing of the church through papal support, while the barons justified their resistance with the Magna Carta and oaths of defiance. Each side claimed legitimacy, and each accused the other of treason. No one could remain neutral for long, for neutrality often meant vulnerability. Merchants, peasants, and townspeople found themselves living in a country where local authority mattered more than the crown. Justice became arbitrary, determined by whoever held the nearest castle. Families were divided, friendships strained as old loyalties were tested by new allegiances. England, once governed by law and tradition, now resembled a patchwork of rival fiefdoms, each preparing for conflict. The king and the barons were not merely squabbling, they were waging the opening moves of a civil war that would sweep across the countryside, leaving devastation and uncertainty in its wake. The realm had split, and with it, the future of England hung precariously in the balance. Rochester Castle, perched on the banks of the River Medway, became one of the defining battlegrounds of England's first civil war. In 1215, the fortress was held by rebel barons determined to resist King John's authority, and it quickly became a symbol of defiance against the crown. For John, capturing Rochester was not just a military objective, it was a matter of pride, power, and the demonstration that rebellion would not go unpunished. The siege began with the king's forces surrounding the castle, cutting off supply lines and blocking any hope of escape. Inside, the garrison of barons and knights prepared for a brutal endurance test. Soldiers stacked stones, reinforced walls, and dug trenches, aware that the coming days would test their courage, skill, and resolve. Outside, John's army established siege engines, including massive catapults designed to batter the walls, and towers intended to give archers a deadly advantage. As days turned into weeks, tension mounted. Starvation became a weapon. Food stores dwindled, and thirst and hunger gnawed at the defenders. Efforts to tunnel beneath the walls were met with countermining. Arrows and stones rained relentlessly from above, and the sounds of war, the clash of metal, the cries of the wounded, the roar of engines filled the air. Finally, the defenders, weakened by hunger and unable to withstand the relentless assault, were forced to surrender. John's victory at Rochester was complete, but it came at a cost. The siege left walls battered, fields trampled, and the surrounding countryside devastated. The cruelty displayed during the siege hardened the barons' resolve. Rather than cowing them into submission, it deepened the hatred and fear that would fuel the wider civil war. Rochester Castle was more than a fortress. It was a testament to the ferocity of the conflict and a grim reminder that England's first civil war would be defined by endurance, desperation, and unyielding ambition. The siege of Rochester Castle was not won through simple battle. It was a war of attrition, where starvation and stone became the weapons of King John. Once the royal forces had surrounded the fortress, the garrison inside faced a grim reality. Walls could hold, but hunger could not be resisted forever. Food and water dwindled with each passing day, and morale began to crumble under the weight of desperation. Inside the castle, the barons and knights rationed what little they had. Soldiers gnawed on stale bread, drank foul water, and counted the days as their strength faded. The castle's stores meant the last weeks were exhausted quickly under siege conditions. Desperation forced defenders into extreme measures. Animals were eaten, and even scraps of leather or roots were chewed to survive. Every mouthful of food became a lifeline, every morsel a small victory in a battle against the inevitable. Outside, John's forces wielded stone with relentless precision. Massive catapults hurled boulders against the castle walls, shaking towers and breaking battlements. Siege engines groaned under the weight of their payloads, each stone a symbol of the king's unyielding pressure. Archers lined the walls of siege towers, sending arrows to punish any who dared venture beyond the gates. The castle itself became a landscape of suffering, both human and structural, stone crashing, walls splintering, and hope eroding. The siege was a slow, brutal test of endurance. Strength faded faster than supplies, and the psychological toll weighed heavily on the defenders. Starvation became as deadly as the stones hurled at them, breaking the will of even the most resolute knights. Eventually, with bodies weakened and walls battered, surrender became inevitable. Rochester Castle's fall was a stark lesson. In civil war, victory was often measured not by the number of swords, but endurance against hunger and relentless siegecraft. England was learning that war could grind down men as surely as any army. When Rochester Castle finally fell to King John's forces, it was hailed as a triumph of royal authority, a decisive victory that proved the crown could still strike fear into the hearts of rebellious barons. Yet the victory was hollow, for the methods used to achieve it sowed seeds of resentment that would fester for years. The castle's defenders had endured weeks of starvation, relentless bombardment, and psychological torment. When they finally surrendered, many were left humiliated, their honor tarnished, and their loyalty further eroded. John's treatment of the garrison was merciless. Some were executed, others imprisoned, and still more were stripped of lands and titles. The king's intent was clear, to make an example that would deter future defiance. Yet the brutality of the siege achieved the opposite. The barons, already frustrated by failed campaigns and excessive taxation, were outraged. Instead of bending them to his will, John had deepened their hatred, confirming that their king ruled through fear rather than justice. Across the kingdom, the news of Rochester's fall traveled quickly. Towns and villages witnessed the consequences of defiance firsthand. Burned fields, shattered gates, and the suffering of common people caught in the crossfire. Sympathy for the barons grew among those who feared arbitrary punishment, while John's reputation as a tyrant spread beyond the rebel strongholds. Victory, in this case, was a double-edged sword. Militarily, John had regained control over a strategic fortress. Politically, however, the siege intensified opposition and strengthened the resolve of those who had sworn to enforce Magna Carta. The king had won the stone and towers, but he had lost trust and goodwill, igniting a cycle of vengeance that would continue to fuel England's first civil war. In the aftermath, it became painfully clear: conquest without justice breeds only more conflict. By late 1215, the civil war in England had reached a perilous stalemate. King John's forces had captured key castles, including Rochester, yet the rebel barons remained defiant. The land was scarred by sieges, burned fields, and displaced peasants, and neither side could claim total dominance. For the barons, the stakes had grown higher than ever. Their lands, honor, and influence were under threat, and the king's wrath showed no sign of mercy. In a moment of desperation, they made a gamble that would change the course of the conflict. With their own military resources strained, the barons turned to an outside power, France. They extended an invitation to Prince Louis, the son of King Philip II, to claim the English crown. This was a risky move, one that could brand them as traitors in the eyes of God and man. Yet the barons calculated that only the arrival of a foreign prince with a professional army could tip the balance against John. Letters were sent across the Channel outlining the opportunity. Promises of support and alliances were offered. The barons were taking a calculated risk. They would trade domestic control for military backing, betting that foreign intervention could restore the liberties they had fought to defend. For Prince Louis, the offer was tempting. France had long sought influence over English affairs, and the Civil War provided a perfect opening. By stepping onto English soil, he could seize a crown with the backing of powerful nobles disillusioned with their king. The gamble was audacious, dangerous, and unpredictable. Inviting a foreign ruler to intervene in domestic politics risked further devastation, but the barons were resolved. When Louis landed, England would face a new dimension of civil war, one that combined rebellion, invasion, and the fragile ambitions of men and kings alike. The first true gamble for the crown had begun. Prince Louis of France, the son of King Philip II, arrived on English shores in 1216 with ambitions that reached far beyond a mere battlefield alliance. For years, France had watched England's internal turmoil with keen interest, and Louis now saw an opportunity to claim a crown nearly within his grasp. To the rebel barons, he represented hope, a figure strong enough to challenge King John and restore balance to a kingdom riven by tyranny. Louis was not merely a guest of convenience. He brought with him a professional army, experienced commanders, and the promise of French resources, which the English barons desperately lacked. His presence transformed the rebellion from scattered uprisings and sieges into a coordinated campaign capable of threatening the crown itself. Towns and castles, long contested, began to pledge allegiance to him, welcoming the French prince as a liberator and protector. Yet Louis's arrival was fraught with risk. To the English populace, a foreign prince was both savior and invader. Loyalty to the Plantagenet dynasty was still strong in many regions, and the introduction of a French claimant could unite opponents against the rebels. Furthermore, Louis's ambitions were clear. This was not a temporary alliance, but a claim to the English throne. The barons were effectively inviting a foreign power to intervene in domestic affairs, a gamble that could change the nation forever. For King John, the arrival of Louis was a direct challenge to his authority. It shifted the war from rebellion to international conflict, adding a new layer of complexity and danger. Across the kingdom, the stage was set for a war unlike any England had seen before. Neighbor against neighbor, baron against baron, and now foreign prince against king. The stakes had never been higher, and the struggle for England's crown had entered a perilous new chapter. England now faced the unthinkable, civil war under the shadow of foreign ambition. The streets of London, normally bustling with merchants, craftsmen, and travelers, had grown tense with uncertainty. The city, England's largest and wealthiest, was strategically vital, and both King John and the rebel barons understood its significance. In 1216, as Prince Louis of France approached with his army, London became the ultimate prize, a symbol of authority, wealth, and political legitimacy. The city's leaders, wary of John's tyranny and encouraged by the barons' promises, made a bold decision. They would open the gates to Louis. It was not simply an act of defiance, it was a calculated gamble. To welcome a foreign prince was dangerous, potentially marking the city as a traitor in the eyes of the crown. Yet John's reputation for cruelty and his repeated broken promises had left Londoners willing to risk everything for protection and stability. As Louis entered the city, banners bearing his arms were raised alongside those of the barons, signaling a temporary but powerful alliance. Citizens lined the streets, some cheering, others anxious, as foreign troops marched past. The city became a stronghold for the rebellion, a base of operations from which the barons and Louis could consolidate power, gather supplies, and plan further campaigns against the king. John, upon hearing of the betrayal, was enraged. London's gates had not just opened, they had shifted the balance of power. By granting access to Louis, the city provided him with legitimacy, resources, and a foothold that could not easily be dislodged. For the rebel barons and their French ally, London's support was a turning point. The city had chosen to defy the king, and in doing so, it had become a beacon of rebellion. England was no longer merely divided, it had opened its heart to invasion, setting the stage for the next dramatic chapter of its first civil war. The gates were open, and the war had entered the streets of the kingdom's most important city. England, 1216. The kingdom had never faced such a surreal and dangerous situation. Two men claiming the same crown, each backed by powerful forces and competing visions of authority. On one side stood King John, the embattled Plantagenet, clinging to his throne with papal support and the loyalty of certain northern barons. On the other, Prince Louis of France, welcomed by rebellious English nobles and the city of London, poised to seize the crown that was not yet his, but dangled within reach. The concept of dual kingship was unprecedented. Loyalty was no longer clear-cut. Families, towns, and castles were forced to choose sides, often splitting along personal ties, geography, or the promise of safety and reward. A lord might support John in one skirmish and Louis in another, depending on shifting fortunes. England had become a chessboard, with barons and citizens as pieces, and the crown itself the ultimate prize. For John, the presence of a French prince on English soil was a nightmare. His authority, already fragile after defeats in France and rebellion at home, was under direct threat. He could no longer rely on fear alone. His reputation had been tarnished, and barons began to question whether loyalty to him was worth the cost. Every town that opened its gates to Louis weakened John's claim and emboldened his enemies. For Louis, the opportunity was both enticing and precarious. England was foreign territory, unfamiliar and hostile in many regions, and the support of rebellious barons could easily shift if victories did not come quickly. He faced the challenge of asserting legitimacy while navigating a nation already deeply fractured. 2 kings, 1 crown. England was suspended in uncertainty. Battles, sieges, and diplomacy would determine who ruled, but the very existence of dual claimants had already reshaped the kingdom. Authority was no longer absolute. Power was contested, and the first true civil war in England's history was unfolding with unprecedented complexity. As Prince Louis of France advanced deeper into England, his army moved with both purpose and caution, a foreign force navigating unfamiliar terrain. French banners rippled in the wind, soldiers marched in disciplined ranks, and commanders coordinated the movement of troops, cavalry, and supplies. Every village passed, every river crossed, brought both opportunity and risk. Louis's army was not merely an invading force, it was a statement, a challenge to the authority of King John, and a symbol of the barons' determination to resist tyranny. The march was strategic as well as psychological. Castles loyal to the barons opened their gates, providing provisions and safe passage, while royalist strongholds braced for confrontation. News of the advancing French army spread quickly, causing panic in some towns and emboldening rebels in others. Louis's presence transformed local skirmishes into part of a larger campaign, giving purpose and coordination to a rebellion that had until now been fragmented. But the campaign was not without its challenges. England's roads were narrow and muddy, slowing movement and straining supply lines. Local resistance sometimes flared, with loyalist knights harassing foraging parties or attempting to block crossings. Disease, fatigue, and the uncertainty of foreign terrain tested the morale of even the most seasoned soldiers. Yet Louis pressed on, understanding that momentum was essential. Hesitation would allow John to regroup and reclaim lost ground. The march of the French army also had a symbolic effect. It demonstrated the seriousness of the barons' rebellion and the willingness of foreign powers to intervene in English politics. As banners advanced across the countryside, towns weighed allegiances, villages prepared defenses, and the kingdom realized that the conflict was no longer internal. It had become an international struggle. England's first civil war had escalated. The march of the French army was more than movement. It was a prelude to battles that would shape the fate of the crown and the future of the nation. King John, enraged by the arrival of Prince Louis and the defection of key barons, launched a decisive campaign to reclaim control of his fractured kingdom. His strategy combined speed, intimidation, and ruthless efficiency. John knew that hesitation would allow the French prince and his allies to consolidate power, so he moved quickly to strike at rebel strongholds, reclaim loyalist territories, and reassert the authority of the crown. John's army was a formidable force, fueled by papal support, professional soldiers, and the loyalty of northern barons who had remained steadfast. Castles that had opened their gates to Louis suddenly found themselves under siege, while towns sympathetic to the rebellion were pressured through threats of fines, imprisonment, and destruction. John's tactics were designed to demonstrate that defiance would be met with swift and merciless punishment. The king's campaign was not limited to military confrontation. He employed political maneuvering to weaken the rebels' alliances, offering pardons to wavering barons and negotiating with towns to secure their loyalty. Messages and envoys carried promises of protection or warnings of retribution, creating a climate of fear that extended beyond the battlefield. Despite his aggressive strategy, John faced significant challenges. The French army remained a potent threat, local resistance continued, and the loyalty of some barons was unpredictable. Supply lines were stretched, and the devastation caused by ongoing conflict hindered recruitment and provisioning. Yet John pressed forward, determined to reclaim the initiative and prevent the kingdom from slipping entirely into the hands of a foreign prince. As the king struck back, England became a patchwork of contested lands, with castles, villages, and roads contested by rival forces. John's campaign would set the stage for dramatic battles, shifting allegiances, and the brutal realities of civil war. Victory was uncertain, but the message was clear. Rebellion would not go unanswered, and the crown remained a force to be reckoned with. King John's campaign against the rebellious barons left a trail of devastation across England, creating what contemporaries would later describe as a scorched kingdom. Villages burned, fields lay trampled and barren, and towns that had resisted royal authority faced harsh punishments. The destruction was both strategic and symbolic. John aimed to punish disloyalty, intimidate wavering nobles, and demonstrate that defiance carried severe consequences. Farmers, peasants, and common folk bore the brunt of the king's wrath. Homes were razed, livestock slaughtered, and granaries emptied, leaving families starving or forced to flee. Roads became dangerous corridors, with soldiers patrolling and raiders exploiting the chaos. The economic and social toll was immense, disrupting trade, food supply, and daily life. England's heartlands, once prosperous, were transformed into landscapes of fear and ruin. The psychological impact on the barons was equally significant. While John's scorched earth tactics inflicted suffering, they also fueled resentment and hardened opposition. Castles and towns that had withstood sieges or remained loyal to the crown often sympathized with those who had suffered under royal retaliation. The king's actions, intended to secure obedience, paradoxically strengthened the rebels' resolve. Yet the strategy was unmistakably effective in one sense. It showcased the ruthlessness of royal power. John sent a clear message that rebellion would be met with overwhelming force and that loyalty was preferable to defiance. Even those who disagreed with the king feared his wrath. The scorched kingdom reflected the harsh realities of medieval civil war, where strategy, survival, and terror were inseparable. England itself became a battlefield, not only for armies, but for communities, resources, and the hearts of its people. By laying waste to the land, John sought to bend his enemies to his will, but the flames he set also stoked the fires of rebellion that would continue to shape the first civil war in England. In the autumn of 1216, King John faced one of the most infamous disasters of his reign, the attempted crossing of the Wash, a wide estuary on England's east coast. The king was retreating from advancing rebel and French forces, carrying a massive convoy of treasure, provisions, and horses. Confident in his familiarity with the terrain, John attempted to navigate the tidal flats, a route that was treacherous even for experienced travelers. The Wash was deceptive. Beneath the shallow waters lay shifting sands and hidden channels, dangerous to both men and animals. As John's convoy moved across, the tide began to rise. Soldiers struggled through the mud, carts sank into quicksand-like patches, and horses faltered in the treacherous terrain. Panic spread quickly as men tried to save both themselves and the precious cargo, but the estuary proved merciless. In a matter of hours, much of the king's treasure, gold, silver, and supplies meant to fund his campaigns, was swallowed by the tidal waters. Horses and provisions were lost, leaving John's army weakened and demoralized. The disaster was both practical and symbolic. It revealed the vulnerability of the king, undermined confidence among his followers, and emboldened his enemies. Rumors of the lost treasure spread rapidly, further tarnishing John's already shaky reputation. The crossing of the Wash marked a turning point in the Civil War. It was not a battle fought with swords, but nature itself had struck a blow against the king. His retreat, meant to safeguard his power, instead exposed his human limitations and the fragility of his authority. In medieval warfare, even the environment could become a formidable adversary, and for John, the estuary became a symbol of miscalculation, loss, and the mounting challenges he would face in the fight to retain England's crown. This misstep would haunt his final campaigns, showing that leadership could be undone as easily by tides as by swords. By the winter of 1216, King John had become a broken man, both in body and spirit. Years of military failures, political betrayal, and personal misfortune had taken their toll. The disaster at the Wash, the loss of treasure, and the steady advance of Prince Louis and the rebel barons had left him humiliated and vulnerable. What remained of his authority was fragile, maintained only through fear, coercion, and the loyalty of a dwindling group of supporters. John's body, worn from constant campaigns and chronic illness, mirrored the exhaustion of his spirit. Each journey, siege, and skirmish had drained him physically, and the weight of failing to secure his kingdom crushed him mentally. Even the simplest decisions became burdensome, clouded by anxiety and distrust. He trusted no one, suspicious of allies and enemies alike, and yet he relied entirely on the counsel of a few loyalists who often had their own agendas. Politically, the king was cornered. Castles across England had fallen to rebel barons or welcomed Louis as liberator. Support among the nobility was eroding daily, and towns that once might have offered refuge now resisted him openly. The king who had once ruled through intimidation and strategy now faced a kingdom increasingly beyond his control. John's personal relationships suffered as well. His cruelty and temper had alienated family, allies, and subjects. Letters of allegiance turned to pleas for mercy. Fealty was replaced by fear and resentment. Even the church, which had once supported him, offered little comfort, as the Pope's influence could not reverse his declining fortunes. In the cold winter months, as his army weakened and rebellion strengthened, King John realized the limits of his power. England was slipping from his grasp, and no amount of force, cunning, or fear could fully restore what had been lost. He was a king broken not just by men, but by circumstance itself. In October 1216, King John, the infamous Plantagenet monarch, drew his final breath at Newark Castle. His death marked the end of a turbulent and tyrannical reign, one defined by cruelty, mismanagement, and relentless conflict. By the time of his passing, England had been plunged into chaos, a kingdom fractured by rebellion, besieged by foreign armies, and scarred by years of civil war. John's health had been failing for months. Chronic illness, likely exacerbated by stress and the harsh conditions of campaigning, left him weakened and bedridden. His body, long subjected to fatigue, malnutrition, and the harsh realities of medieval warfare, could no longer sustain the weight of kingship. Even as he lay dying, the consequences of his actions continued to unfold across the country. Castles remained in rebel hands, towns were divided, and the threat of Prince Louis's invasion loomed large. The king's death sent shockwaves through England. For the barons and rebels, it was both a relief and an opportunity. John's death removed a tyrant from power, opening the door to negotiation and reconciliation, particularly under the guidance of the young Henry III and his regents. For loyalists, it was a moment of uncertainty. The throne was now occupied by a 9-year-old child, requiring strong leadership and careful diplomacy to prevent further collapse. John's legacy was complex and grim. His reign had demonstrated the dangers of unchecked authority and the consequences of ruling through fear. Yet in death, the possibility of healing and unification emerged. The death of the tyrant did not immediately end the civil war, but it shifted its dynamics, weakening the rebels' momentum and giving new hope to a kingdom exhausted by conflict. King John was gone, but the consequences of his reign would shape England for generations, leaving a cautionary tale of ambition, cruelty, and the fragile nature of power. The death of King John in October 1216 left England at a crossroads. The crown passed to his 9-year-old son, Henry III, a boy too young to command armies or negotiate with rebellious barons, yet old enough to inherit a legacy of turmoil. With the kingdom fractured and foreign forces occupying key territories, the child king's accession was both a moment of vulnerability and an opportunity for renewal. Henry's rise required the guidance of regents, particularly William Marshal, one of England's most respected knights and statesmen. Marshal, appointed as regent, understood that the survival of the monarchy depended on restoring trust with the barons, maintaining loyalty among the nobility, and reclaiming lands lost to Prince Louis and the rebels. His strategy was delicate, a combination of diplomacy, restraint, and the occasional show of military strength to assert the authority of the crown, without provoking further rebellion. The barons, weary from years of civil war, were more receptive to negotiations with a child king than with the harsh, vengeful John. They saw in Henry's youth the possibility of a ruler who could grow under counsel, a king who might respect their rights and privileges. For many, allegiance to the boy king was a pragmatic choice, offering hope for stability while avoiding the uncertainty of prolonged conflict. Across England, the mood shifted. Castles that had resisted the crown began to reopen their gates. Towns pledged loyalty, and local leaders sought terms of reconciliation. Though Prince Louis still held sway in parts of the kingdom, the death of John and the ascension of Henry weakened his position, fracturing rebel morale. The rise of a child king did more than change the occupant of the throne. It transformed the civil war itself. Where once rebellion had been a desperate struggle against a tyrant, it now faced a kingdom united under the promise of continuity, counsel, and cautious hope for peace. England's future hung in the balance, resting on the shoulders of a boy who would grow into his crown. In the turmoil following King John's death, one man emerged as the steady hand capable of guiding England through its most perilous moment. William Marshal, known to history as the Last Knight. A veteran of countless battles, tournaments, and courts, Marshal's reputation was built on loyalty, honor, and unmatched skill. Now, at the age of 70, he faced his greatest challenge, not on the battlefield, but in the treacherous arena of politics and civil war. Marshal was appointed regent for the 9-year-old Henry III, a role that demanded wisdom, diplomacy, and an ability to command respect from both loyalists and rebel barons. He understood that brute force alone would not secure the crown. England had been fractured by John's tyranny and years of rebellion, and the people hungered for stability. Marshal's strategy combined careful negotiation, judicious use of military strength, and appeals to the barons' sense of honor and pragmatism. He moved swiftly to reassure rebel lords, offering pardons and confirming rights granted under Magna Carta, while simultaneously fortifying key castles and securing royal strongholds. Marshal's presence was a symbol of continuity and credibility, a warrior who had served kings faithfully, whose word carried weight, and whose experience could bridge the divide between a tyrant's reign and a hopeful future. Marshal also understood the psychological importance of leadership. By emphasizing the legitimacy of Henry III and presenting the young king as a figure who could embody justice and fairness, he undermined the appeal of Prince Louis and weakened rebel morale. Slowly, castles and towns returned to royal allegiance, and the kingdom began to stabilize. William Marshal's regency proved that the power of a kingdom was not merely in the crown or the sword, but in the wisdom, honor, and foresight of those who wielded it. In guiding Henry III and restoring unity, Marshal became the linchpin of England's survival, a final, towering figure of the age of knights and chivalry, ensuring that the First Civil War did not destroy the monarchy entirely. In the aftermath of King John's death, England faced a fragile and uncertain peace. The Civil War had left castles contested, towns divided, and the monarchy weakened. It was within this volatile landscape that William Marshal, regent for the young Henry III, made a bold and transformative decision to reissue Magna Carta. This act would not only solidify royal authority, but also address the grievances that had sparked rebellion in the first place. Reissuing the charter was a calculated political move. By reaffirming the principles of Magna Carta, Marshal sought to reassure the barons that their rights would be respected under the new king. It was an olive branch to the rebellious nobility, signaling that the monarchy recognized the importance of law, justice, and accountability. At the same time, it reinforced Henry III's legitimacy, presenting him as a ruler who would govern with fairness rather than tyranny. The act of reissuing the charter was also deeply symbolic. It represented the triumph of law over fear, of negotiation over violence. The barons, who had once resorted to rebellion to enforce their rights, now saw a path toward stability and cooperation. Castles that had resisted royal authority slowly opened their gates, and towns pledged loyalty to the crown once more. By reissuing Magna Carta, Marshal transformed a document born of conflict into a tool for reconciliation. It was not merely a legal guarantee, but a statement of intent. The crown would honor the balance of power between king and nobility, ensuring that England could heal from the devastation of civil war. This decision marked a turning point. The reissued Magna Carta helped stabilize Henry III's reign, restored trust among the barons, and laid the foundation for the enduring principle that even a king is subject to the law. In doing so, it turned a symbol of rebellion into a cornerstone of governance, reshaping England's political landscape for generations to come. By early 1217, the momentum of the Civil War had begun to shift. The initial surge of rebellion, bolstered by Prince Louis of France, faced unexpected challenges. Despite early victories and support from powerful English barons, cracks began to appear in the rebel coalition. Loyalties were proving fragile, and many nobles started to question the wisdom of continuing a conflict that threatened not only their lands, but the stability of the kingdom itself. Several factors fueled this wavering. The prolonged fighting had exhausted resources, drained manpower, and disrupted trade and agriculture. Barons who had pledged support to Louis saw their estates neglected, income dwindling, and local populations suffering. The costs of rebellion were becoming painfully tangible, and the rewards less certain. Meanwhile, the young Henry III, under the guidance of William Marshal, began to present a credible alternative, a king who could unify the kingdom without the destructive force of tyranny that had defined his father's reign. Marshal's diplomacy was subtle but effective. He offered pardons and confirmed the rights promised in Magna Carta, signaling that the crown could respect noble privileges while restoring order. Loyalist knights and towns pledged their allegiance, demonstrating that resistance was no longer the only viable path. Letters and envoys from royalist forces reminded barons that continued support for Louis carried risks of excommunication, loss of property, and alienation from influential allies. The combination of military pressure, political reassurance, and practical realities led many barons to reconsider. Their wavering signaled the beginning of the collapse of rebel unity. The dream of a French prince ruling England began to falter, while the appeal of reconciliation with the crown grew stronger. In the fractured landscape of civil war, shifting loyalties would soon play a decisive role, tipping the balance towards eventual peace and consolidation under Henry III. The spring of 1217 brought a decisive moment in England's first civil war, the Battle of Lincoln. Also known as Lincoln Fair, this confrontation would determine the fate of the kingdom and decide whether Prince Louis of France could press his claim to the English crown. The city of Lincoln, with its strategic castle perched above the surrounding plains, became the focal point for royalist and rebel forces alike. Prince Louis had amassed a strong army of French knights and rebel barons, confident that he could secure a major victory. The castle itself was well defended, and the town surrounding it provided a base for supplies and reinforcements. Louis's forces laid siege to the castle, intending to break royalist resistance and solidify his foothold in England. But the young Henry III's regent, William Marshal, was determined to reverse the tide. Marshal gathered loyalist forces, experienced knights, men-at-arms, and reinforcements from northern barons, and marched swiftly toward Lincoln. The clash was brutal and chaotic. Royalist forces charged across the open fields, meeting the combined strength of French knights and English rebels. Arrows darkened the sky, swords clashed, and banners fluttered amid dust and smoke. Marshal's leadership proved decisive. His strategy relied on coordinated attacks, flanking maneuvers, and exploiting gaps in the enemy lines. Despite being outnumbered in certain sectors, the Royalists pressed relentlessly, turning what seemed a desperate defense into a crushing victory. The aftermath of Lincoln was monumental. Prince Louis's forces were scattered, many barons surrendered or defected back to the Royalist side. The battle shattered the rebel coalition, dramatically weakening the French claim to the throne. News of the victory spread quickly, boosting morale for Henry III's supporters and signaling that the monarchy, under Marshal's guidance, could survive. The Battle of Lincoln became a turning point in England's first civil war, a clash that combined courage, strategy, and timing, ultimately proving that the monarchy could endure, even after years of rebellion and foreign intervention. The Battle of Lincoln, later remembered as the Lincoln Fair, marked a dramatic turning point in England's first civil war. Fought in May 1217, The conflict erupted around Lincoln Castle, a formidable fortress controlling one of the most strategic regions of the kingdom. Prince Louis of France, backed by rebellious English barons, had laid siege to the castle, seeking a decisive victory that could cement his claim to the English crown. The scene outside Lincoln was chaotic yet tense. The flat plains surrounding the city became the stage for thousands of soldiers, French knights, rebel barons, and local levies arrayed against loyalist forces led by William Marshal, regent for the young Henry III. The battle commenced with the thunder of cavalry charges, the whistling of arrows, and the clash of steel on steel. Marshal, a veteran of countless campaigns, displayed extraordinary tactical skill, coordinating infantry and cavalry to outmaneuver the besieging forces. Despite the numerical strength of Louis's army, Marshal exploited the terrain and morale of his troops, pressing the attack with precision. Rebel barons who had once appeared confident now found themselves encircled or overwhelmed. The fighting was intense and merciless, with banners torn, fortifications battered, and cries of men and horses echoing across the battlefield. By the end of the day, the outcome was clear. Louis's army was decisively defeated, and many French and rebel soldiers were captured. The victory shattered the momentum of the rebellion, forcing wavering barons to reconsider their allegiance. Lincoln became a symbol of royalist resilience and a turning point in the struggle for England. The Lincoln Fair was more than a battle. It was a statement. It demonstrated that the monarchy could recover, that strategic leadership and loyalty could overcome even the threat of foreign intervention, and that England's civil war, though devastating, had begun to tip toward resolution. The shadow of civil conflict remained, but hope for unity returned to the kingdom. After the crushing defeat at the Battle of Lincoln, Prince Louis of France found his campaign in England faltering. What had once seemed like a promising bid for the crown, a rebellion bolstered by French knights and disillusioned English barons, was rapidly losing momentum. The loss at Lincoln shattered both morale and credibility, leaving Louis in a precarious position as winter approached and supplies dwindled. The rebel coalition, once united under the banner of French intervention, began to fracture. Some English barons, seeing the tide turning, abandoned Louis and sought reconciliation with the crown, accepting pardons and reaffirming loyalty to the young Henry III. Others, disillusioned by the high cost of war, withdrew their forces, unwilling to risk further loss of life, property, or influence. Louis's army, far from home and reliant on fragile supply lines, struggled to maintain cohesion. Desertions and illness further weakened his position, eroding the strength of his once formidable force. The political landscape also shifted. William Marshal and the royalist regents skillfully negotiated with wavering barons, offering terms that combined clemency with strategic reinforcement of Henry III's authority. Towns and fortresses that had previously supported Louis reconsidered their stance, understanding that continued resistance might bring more devastation than reconciliation. Louis's ambitions, which had once appeared bold and unstoppable, now faced the harsh reality of logistical challenges, divided allies, and a reinvigorated monarchy. His claim to the throne weakened with each passing week, and the dream of ruling England began to fade. By late 1217, it was clear that the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The French prince's intervention, once a serious threat, was now a dwindling shadow of its former promise. England, battered but resilient, began to coalesce under the regency of Marshal and the guidance of Henry III, signaling that the First Civil War was drawing to a close and that foreign ambitions would not dictate the kingdom's future. While battles on land shaped the course of England's first civil war, the struggle extended to the waters of the English Channel, where control of the sea became a decisive factor. The naval conflict of 1217, culminating in the Battle of Sandwich, demonstrated that warfare was no longer confined to castles and open fields. The fate of the kingdom depended equally on ships, tides, and strategy. Prince Louis of France, determined to reinforce his campaign, relied on a fleet to transport soldiers, supplies, and artillery from Normandy to English shores. The French fleet was formidable, but navigating the Channel's treacherous currents and tides proved perilous. Loyalist forces, under the command of Hubert de Burgh and other royalist leaders, recognized the strategic necessity of intercepting these reinforcements. Control of the sea lanes meant that Louis's ambitions could be contained or cut off entirely. The clash off Sandwich was fierce and decisive. English ships, smaller and more maneuverable, engaged the larger French vessels with coordinated attacks. Arrows, crossbows, and flaming projectiles rained down upon decks, while grappling hooks allowed boarding parties to fight hand-to-hand amid the chaos of rolling ships. Storms and strong tides added another layer of danger, turning the Channel into both battlefield and obstacle. Louis's fleet suffered devastating losses. Many ships were captured or sunk, soldiers drowned or forced to surrender, and critical supplies never reached the French army on land. The defeat not only weakened Louis militarily, but also shattered the morale of his English allies, reinforcing the perception that the foreign prince's claim was no longer viable. The war at sea proved pivotal. By denying Louis reinforcements and supplies, the Royalist Navy ensured that the rebellion could not regain momentum. England's first civil war had demonstrated that mastery of both land and sea was essential to victory, and that the crown's survival depended on strategic command of every battlefield, not just the castles. In August 1217, the fate of England's first civil war was decided on the waters off Sandwich, a small port town on the southeastern coast. Known as the Battle of Sandwich, this naval confrontation would crush Prince Louis of France's hopes of claiming the English crown and cement the young Henry III's hold on the kingdom. Louis had relied on a fleet to transport reinforcements, supplies, and artillery from Normandy. These troops were essential to sustaining. In August 1217, the fate of England's first civil war was decided on the waters off Sandwich, a small port town on the southeastern coast. Known as the Battle of Sandwich, this naval confrontation would crush Prince Louis of France's hopes of claiming the English crown and cement the young Henry III's hold on the kingdom. Louis had relied on a fleet to transport reinforcements, supplies, and artillery from Normandy. These troops were essential to sustaining his army in England and bolstering the morale of his English baronial allies. Recognizing the stakes, the Royalist commanders, including Hubert de Burgh and Elias of Dereham, prepared a fleet to intercept the French convoy. England's survival depended on stopping these reinforcements before they could tip the balance back in Louis's favor. The battle itself was chaotic and brutal. English ships, smaller and more maneuverable than their French counterparts, rammed, grappled, and boarded the larger vessels. Archers and crossbowmen rained fire down on decks, while soldiers fought hand-to-hand amid the rolling waves. Flaming projectiles added terror, setting French ships ablaze and forcing troops into the cold waters of the Channel. Tides and sudden storms complicated maneuvers, making every decision a gamble with life and death at stake. By the day's end, the outcome was decisive. The French fleet was destroyed or captured,
Reinforcements and supplies never reached Louis's army, and hundreds of soldiers drowned or were taken prisoner. The defeat shattered the morale of the French prince's English allies and exposed the vulnerability of foreign intervention. The Battle of Sandwich marked a turning point in the Civil War. With his army isolated and support dwindling, Louis's ambitions crumbled. The crown, under the guidance of William Marshal and the young Henry III, emerged stronger, demonstrating that mastery of both land and sea was essential to securing England's future. The waters off Sandwich had determined the fate of a kingdom. Following the crushing defeat at the Battle of Sandwich, Prince Louis of France faced the inevitable reality. His claim to the English throne was collapsing. What had begun as a bold attempt to capitalize on the Barons' rebellion now seemed a distant and unattainable ambition. With his fleet decimated, reinforcements cut off, and English allies wavering, Louis had little choice but to reassess his position. In the north and south, rebel barons who had initially supported Louis began to abandon him. Some surrendered their castles to royalist forces. Others negotiated pardons and reconciliations under the terms offered by William Marshal, regent for Henry III. The unity that had fueled the rebellion disintegrated as practicality overtook ambition. The cost of continued resistance, both in blood and property, far outweighed any potential gain from a French king on English soil. Louis himself, recognizing that his forces were insufficient to sustain a prolonged campaign, began negotiating with the English crown. Letters and envoys carried proposals for peace, pledges of withdrawal, and promises to relinquish claims. By the end of 1217, Louis formally abandoned his claim to the English throne, agreeing to return to France and leaving the kingdom in the hands of Henry III and his regents. The withdrawal of the French prince marked the end of the foreign threat in England's First Civil War. While pockets of resistance remained, the political landscape shifted dramatically. The monarchy, though weakened by years of rebellion, regained authority, and the young king's position became secure. The abandonment of Louis's claim demonstrated the limits of ambition in the face of logistics, loyalty, and local realities. England had endured foreign invasion, internal rebellion, and political upheaval, yet the crown survived. The Civil War was not only a story of battles and sieges, but also of pragmatism and the eventual triumph of stability over chaos. England could finally begin to heal. With Prince Louis of France abandoning his claim to the English throne, the stage was set for the final act of England's First Civil War, the negotiation of peace. Though the immediate military threat had subsided, the kingdom remained fractured. Castles had been damaged, towns had suffered, and loyalties had shifted repeatedly over the course of years. The task of restoring stability fell to William Marshal, regent for the young Henry III, whose wisdom and diplomacy would prove as decisive as any battle. Marshal understood that lasting peace required more than military victory. It demanded reconciliation with former rebels and assurances that the rights and privileges of the barons would be respected. Letters and envoys were dispatched across the kingdom, inviting barons to swear allegiance to Henry III and promising pardons for past actions taken during the conflict. Terms were carefully negotiated, balancing forgiveness with the necessity of reasserting royal authority. The reissued Magna Carta became a cornerstone of these agreements, signaling that the monarchy would honor legal constraints while maintaining order. The process was delicate. Some barons were suspicious, fearing hidden retribution or a return to the tyranny they had endured under King John. Marshal's reputation, however, provided credibility. His honor and experience, reassured nobles that their loyalty would be respected and that the young king's reign could be fair and just. Gradually, castles were returned to royal control, and previously rebellious towns pledged their support. Negotiating peace marked a turning point for England. It ended active hostilities, restored the monarchy's legitimacy, and began the long process of healing the kingdom. The Civil War had tested the limits of authority, loyalty, and governance, but through careful diplomacy and compromise, England emerged with its monarchy intact and a framework for balancing power between king and barons, a fragile but vital foundation for the nation's future. The Treaty of Lambeth, signed in September 1217, marked the formal conclusion of England's first civil war and the end of Prince Louis of France's ambitions on English soil. Negotiated after months of military defeat and waning support, the treaty reflected a pragmatic resolution that prioritized stability and the restoration of the monarchy under the young Henry III. By this point, Louis had suffered significant setbacks. His fleet had been destroyed at the Battle of Sandwich, key rebel barons had abandoned him, and morale among his troops was at a low ebb. The treaty represented a recognition of these realities. Louis would formally renounce all claims to the English crown and return to France, while the English monarchy, led by Henry III and guided by William Marshal, would confirm the legitimacy of his reign. The terms were surprisingly conciliatory, designed to prevent further bloodshed and encourage the reintegration of former rebels. Louis was allowed to leave England with honor, retaining his personal dignity, while the barons who had supported him were offered pardons and reassurances that their lands and privileges would be respected. This approach balanced justice with pragmatism, avoiding a punitive settlement that might have sparked renewed rebellion. The Treaty of Lambeth also had symbolic significance. It reinforced the principle that foreign intervention could not dictate the future of England, and that the monarchy's authority, though weakened by John's reign and civil war, could endure through negotiation and compromise. By formally closing the chapter on French involvement, the treaty allowed the kingdom to turn its attention to rebuilding, consolidating royal authority, and strengthening governance under Henry III. In the wake of the treaty, England began to recover from years of conflict. Castles were repaired, towns rebuilt, and loyalty gradually restored. The Treaty of Lambeth demonstrated that even in the aftermath of civil war, diplomacy, negotiation, and pragmatism could restore peace, offering a foundation for the stability of the monarchy and the kingdom for decades to come. By the end of 1217, England's first civil war had finally drawn to a close. Years of rebellion, sieges, foreign intervention, and political turmoil had left the kingdom scarred, yet a fragile peace now took hold. The death of King John, the ascension of the young Henry III, and the decisive victories at Lincoln and Sandwich had shifted the balance decisively in favor of the monarchy. The conclusion of the war was not the result of a single battle, but the cumulative effect of strategy, diplomacy, and the erosion of rebel unity. Prince Louis of France, recognizing the futility of continued fighting after his naval defeat and the collapse of support among English barons, formally abandoned his claim to the throne. With his withdrawal, the last serious challenge to Henry III's rule was removed, leaving the young king's regents, particularly William Marshal, in control of the kingdom's restoration. The end of hostilities brought relief and cautious optimism. Castles that had been contested were returned to royal authority. Towns that had suffered sieges began to rebuild, and barons who had wavered during the rebellion reconciled with the crown. The reissuance of Magna Carta served as a tangible guarantee that noble rights would be respected, helping to solidify loyalty and prevent further unrest. Though peace had returned, the legacy of the Civil War lingered. Fields lay devastated, trade routes had been disrupted, and England had experienced firsthand the consequences of divided authority. Yet the monarchy, tempered by crisis and guided by capable regents, had survived. The kingdom could begin the slow process of recovery, reconciliation, and rebuilding. The war's end marked a turning point in English history, a confirmation that even amid rebellion and foreign threat, the crown could endure. It was a hard-earned peace, forged through both bloodshed and negotiation, and a foundation upon which England's monarchy and the delicate balance between king and barons would continue to evolve. The Civil War had left England battered and fractured, yet amid the chaos, one enduring legacy emerged: Magna Carta. Though first sealed in 1215 under King John, the Charter's survival was far from guaranteed. Its principles had been tested through rebellion, foreign intervention, and civil strife. Yet by the end of the conflict, the reissued Magna Carta under the young Henry III had secured its place as a cornerstone of English governance. Magna Carta represented more than a legal document. It embodied the idea that even a king was bound by law. During the rebellion, the barons had fought not merely for power, but for recognition of their rights and protection from arbitrary rule. The Charter's reaffirmation provided a framework for reconciliation, assuring former rebels that their grievances would be acknowledged and that royal authority would operate within defined limits. William Marshall, acting as regent, understood the political necessity of preserving and enforcing Magna Carta. By doing so, he bridged the gap between the monarchy and the barons, fostering trust and cooperation. Castles returned to royal control, and towns pledged loyalty once more, drawn by the promise of legal guarantees and a moderated exercise of power. The survival of Magna Carta also had symbolic significance. It demonstrated that even in times of extreme crisis, principles of justice and accountability could endure. The Charter's resilience reinforced the notion that governance was not merely the exercise of force, but a contract between ruler and ruled. In the aftermath of the First Civil War, Magna Carta became more than a tool of negotiation. It became a symbol of stability and hope. Its principles would echo through centuries, shaping the future of England and influencing legal traditions worldwide. From rebellion to reconciliation, the survival of Magna Carta ensured that the lessons of tyranny, resistance, and compromise were not forgotten. With the First Civil War concluded, England entered a period of fragile recovery and recalibration. The turbulence of rebellion, foreign intervention, and King John's tyrannical reign had exposed the vulnerabilities of the monarchy and tested the resilience of the kingdom's institutions. By the end of the conflict, a new balance of power emerged, reshaping the relationship between king, barons, and the wider population. The young Henry III, under the guidance of William Marshall and later regents, assumed the throne as more than a symbolic figurehead. His authority, though tempered by age and experience, was now legitimized through both bloodline and the careful negotiation of noble loyalty. The barons, having witnessed the devastation of rebellion and the failure of foreign intervention, recognized the necessity of a cooperative monarchy. They gained a reinforced voice through the reaffirmation of Magna Carta, ensuring that the crown could not rule unchecked. This new equilibrium extended beyond legal documents. Loyalties were no longer dictated solely by fear or coercion. They were negotiated, conditional, and subject to political reality. Former rebels were integrated back into the kingdom's governance, rewarded for allegiance, and carefully monitored to prevent renewed unrest. Towns and cities, having suffered during sieges and occupations, began to rebuild, fostering a sense of civic participation and cautious optimism. At the same time, the monarchy retained its essential authority. Castles, revenues, and military command ensured that the crown could enforce law and order when necessary, balancing noble influence without surrendering sovereignty. England had learned that governance required compromise, but also decisive action in the face of rebellion. The First Civil War left a lasting legacy, a kingdom more resilient, a monarchy more accountable, and a baronial class more empowered. This new balance of power, born from conflict, negotiation, and compromise, would define the political landscape of England for generations, establishing a precedent for the delicate interplay between authority and liberty that shaped the nation's future. The First Civil War in England, fought between King John, rebellious barons, and the French Prince Louis, left deep scars on the kingdom, both physical and political. Its legacy was written not only in the charred ruins of castles and burned villages, but also in the lessons learned about power, loyalty, and governance. The blood spilled on the fields, in the sieges, and across towns became the harsh instructor of a new political reality. One of the clearest lessons was the limits of tyranny. King John's cruelty, extortion, and arbitrary rule had triggered rebellion, demonstrating that unchecked authority could provoke widespread resistance. Nobles and towns alike realized that the crown could not demand absolute obedience without consequence. Fear alone was insufficient to secure loyalty. Respect, negotiation, and recognition of rights were equally essential for long-term stability. Another lesson emerged from the role of foreign intervention. Inviting Prince Louis of France had seemed a viable solution to the barons' grievances, but the ensuing conflict revealed the dangers of relying on external powers. Foreign armies could shift the balance temporarily, but they could also worsen destruction and erode domestic control. England's experience reinforced the principle that sovereignty and self-determination were paramount, even amidst internal strife. Finally, the Civil War underscored the value of compromise. The reaffirmation of Magna Carta, the pardons extended to former rebels, and the negotiation of peace through treaties like Lambeth illustrated that reconciliation was more effective than continued violence. Leadership, as shown by William Marshall's regency, required not only martial skill, but also wisdom, diplomacy, and the ability to build trust. The First Civil War left England bloodied but wiser. The lessons etched in its aftermath about power, justice, and compromise would influence governance for generations. It was a conflict whose pain ensured that the next chapter of English history would be guided by caution, law, and the enduring awareness that liberty, once threatened, must be protected. The conclusion of England's First Civil War marked more than the end of hostilities. It heralded the birth of a new form of governance, constitutional rule. The struggle between King John, rebellious barons, and foreign intervention had exposed the weaknesses of absolute monarchy and the dangers of unchecked power. Out of this turbulence emerged a framework that would begin to define the relationship between king, nobility, and law. Central to this transformation was the reaffirmation of Magna Carta under the young Henry III. While the charter had initially been a reaction to John's tyranny, its reissuance after the war signaled a profound shift. The crown was no longer beyond accountability. The barons' rights were formally recognized, legal procedures were guaranteed, and the principle that the king must govern within established boundaries gained unprecedented legitimacy. In effect, the monarchy had become bound by law. This shift was not merely symbolic. The Civil War had shown that rebellion could topple a tyrant, yet compromise offered a path to stability. William Marshall, as regent, demonstrated that leadership required balancing authority with negotiation, ensuring that the king could rule while respecting the rights of the nobility. The reintegration of former rebels, the protection of towns and castles, and the careful management of finances and military forces all reinforced the foundations of constitutional governance. The birth of constitutional rule in England was gradual and imperfect, but the First Civil War had created the conditions for its emergence. Authority was no longer absolute. It was shared, negotiated, and constrained by law. The kingdom had learned that stability depended on balance between monarchy and barons, power and justice, rule and consent. From the ashes of rebellion, England began a long journey toward a system where even kings were subject to law, laying the cornerstone of governance that would endure for centuries. Despite its profound impact on England, the First Civil War is often overlooked in history, overshadowed by later conflicts like the Wars of the Roses or the English Civil War of the 17th century. Yet this forgotten civil war shaped the monarchy, the nobility, and the legal framework of the kingdom in ways that would resonate for centuries. The conflict revealed the fragility of royal authority under King John. His failures, arbitrary taxation, broken promises, and cruelty ignited rebellion, showing that even a powerful monarch could be challenged when governance became oppressive. The Civil War also demonstrated the limits of fear as a tool for control. Barons and towns were willing to risk life, property, and allegiance to demand their rights. Foreign intervention, in the form of Prince Louis of France, added another layer to the war's complexity. While Louis's arrival initially strengthened the rebel cause, his eventual defeat illustrated the challenges of sustaining a foreign-backed campaign and underscored the resilience of English forces under competent leadership like William Marshall. The war became a test of strategy, loyalty, and political acumen rather than just brute force. Perhaps most importantly, the conflict cemented the significance of Magna Carta. The charter, first sealed in 1215, survived both rebellion and war, emerging as a cornerstone for constitutional governance. By reaffirming baronial rights and limiting royal authority, the First Civil War turned Magna Carta from a reactive document into a lasting symbol of law and accountability. Though often forgotten, the First Civil War left a permanent imprint on England. It reshaped the monarchy, strengthened the role of barons, and established principles of governance that would endure. The rebellions, sieges, and battles of this period were not merely historical footnotes. They were formative events that defined the trajectory of English law, monarchy, and society for generations to come. The First Civil War in England, though often overshadowed by later conflicts, left echoes that would reverberate through centuries of English history. The struggles between King John, rebellious barons, and foreign intervention revealed fundamental truths about governance, power, and the rights of the ruled, lessons that shaped the monarchy and society long after the last battles were fought. One of the clearest echoes was the enduring principle that the crown was not absolute. The reaffirmation of Magna Carta after the Civil War established that even a king was subject to law, a concept that would influence generations of rulers. The idea that authority must be balanced with accountability became a foundational element of English constitutional development, shaping how monarchs governed and how nobles, and eventually commoners, understood their rights. The war also underscored the dangers and consequences of unchecked tyranny. King John's reign demonstrated that cruelty, mismanagement, and disregard for established rights could provoke rebellion, destabilize the kingdom, and invite foreign intervention. These lessons were not forgotten. Later monarchs would face the cautionary example of John's failures, learning that legitimacy depended on a delicate balance between power and justice. Moreover, the First Civil War illustrated the importance of leadership and diplomacy. William Marshall's regency for Henry III proved that strategic wisdom, negotiation, and the capacity to reconcile divided factions could secure a kingdom even in the wake of devastating conflict. His guidance helped stabilize England and allowed the monarchy to endure, setting a precedent for future regents and statesmen. The First Civil War's echoes also reached the broader legal and political culture of England. By surviving rebellion, foreign claims, and internal division, the monarchy learned to respect the law, honor agreements, and govern with measured authority. The lessons of 1215 to 1217 became part of the collective memory of the kingdom, a reminder that even in chaos, principles of law, compromise, and governance could shape the enduring future of England.
Following the resolution of England's First Civil War, young Henry III ascended the throne under the guidance of William Marshall and other experienced regents. Though only 9 years old at the time, Henry would go on to rule for over 50 years, one of the longest reigns in English history. His early years were shaped by the legacy of rebellion, the triumphs and failures of his father, and the careful stewardship of his regency, all of which influenced the direction of his monarchy. Henry III inherited a kingdom still recovering from war. Castles had been besieged, towns ravaged, and relationships between the crown and barons were cautious and fragile. The reaffirmation of Magna Carta provided a foundation for his rule, reminding both king and nobles that authority was bound by law. Early in his reign, Henry focused on consolidating power, restoring royal finances, and rebuilding the infrastructure that had suffered during years of civil conflict. The regent's guidance helped Henry navigate the delicate balance between asserting monarchical authority and maintaining baronial loyalty. William Marshall's influence, in particular, ensured that compromise, diplomacy, and respect for noble privileges tempered the exercise of power. This approach helped prevent the resurgence of large-scale rebellion and provided stability in the wake of the First Civil War. Henry III's long reign saw both achievements and challenges, but the experience of ascending the throne in a post-Civil War kingdom shaped his perspective as a monarch. He learned that legitimacy depended not merely on inheritance, but on wise governance, negotiation, and the ability to maintain the fragile balance of power between king and barons. The First Civil War's lessons endured throughout his reign, influencing his policies, relationships, and the evolution of the English monarchy. Through Henry III, the monarchy transitioned from the chaos of rebellion to the stability of tradition, law, and long-term governance, leaving a lasting imprint on England's political landscape. William Marshall, often remembered as the last great knight, left a legacy that extended far beyond the battlefield. His role during England's First Civil War was pivotal, not only in military victories, but in stabilizing the kingdom and guiding the young Henry III through one of the most turbulent periods in English history. Marshall's influence ensured that the monarchy survived, and his principles of leadership, honor, and diplomacy shaped the future of English governance. As regent, Marshall demonstrated that strength alone was insufficient to secure a kingdom. He combined military skill with political acumen, negotiating with rebellious barons, reasserting royal authority, and reaffirming Magna Carta to balance power between the crown and the nobility. His ability to inspire loyalty, maintain alliances, and reconcile opposing factions
prevented England from descending into further chaos after King John's death. Marshall's legacy was also cultural and symbolic. He embodied the ideals of chivalry, loyalty, and service, showing that a knight's duty was not merely to fight, but to govern wisely and justly. He set a standard for leadership that transcended personal ambition, placing the stability of the kingdom and the welfare of its people above self-interest. Even after his death in 1219, Marshall's influence endured. The young Henry III inherited a kingdom stabilized by his guidance, a monarchy tempered by compromise, and a legal framework strengthened by the principles Marshall had upheld. The barons, once wary of royal power, learned that honor, negotiation, and respect could coexist with authority. William Marshall's legacy was thus twofold: as a warrior who shaped the outcomes of civil war, and as a statesman who ensured that England emerged from rebellion with its monarchy intact. His life became a template for leadership, demonstrating that courage, wisdom, and integrity could preserve a nation even in its darkest hours. The First Civil War in England left a lasting reminder of how fleeting opportunity can be in the high stakes of medieval politics. For Prince Louis of France, the rebellion offered a chance to claim the English crown, yet that chance ultimately slipped through his fingers. Louis's ambition, bolstered by the discontented English barons and the chaos of King John's reign, seemed within reach, yet the convergence of military setbacks, political miscalculations, and resilient leadership by England's loyalists denied him the crown he sought. Louis's campaign initially appeared promising. Castles surrendered, barons rallied to his cause, and the English crown appeared vulnerable after John's failures and death. However, key turning points shifted the momentum against him. The decisive Battle of Lincoln shattered the rebel coalition, while the naval Battle of Sandwich destroyed his fleet and cut off reinforcements. Morale among his English allies collapsed, and desertion became widespread. What had begun as a serious claim now looked increasingly untenable. Diplomacy further sealed Louis's fate. William Marshall's skillful negotiation, the reissuance of Magna Carta, and the offer of pardons to wavering barons undermined the French prince's appeal. Nobles realized that continued support for Louis could prolong destruction and weaken their own holdings. The prince's foreign status also created suspicion and resistance, limiting his ability to consolidate control. By September 1217, Louis formally renounced his claim through the Treaty of Lambeth, returning to France and leaving England's monarchy intact. His missed opportunity became a cautionary tale. Even with military strength and initial support, ambition alone could not overcome the resilience, strategy, and unity of the kingdom. France had aimed to claim England, yet the crown remained beyond its reach, underscoring the limits of intervention and the enduring power of domestic legitimacy. England's first civil war had tested the nation, but it had also demonstrated that sovereignty could withstand foreign ambition. The First Civil War had left England scarred, but from the destruction emerged a transformed kingdom. The years of rebellion, sieges, and foreign intervention had tested the monarchy, the barons, and the people, reshaping the political, legal, and social landscape of the nation. By 1217, England was no longer the same country that had entered the conflict under King John. It had been tempered by crisis and forged by necessity into a kingdom more resilient and aware of the balance between authority and rights. One of the most significant transformations was the strengthened role of law. The reaffirmation of Magna Carta had institutionalized the idea that the king's power was not absolute, that barons and subjects had rights, and that governance required accountability. This principle, tested through civil war, became a foundation for England's evolving legal and constitutional framework, influencing how monarchs would govern for generations. The monarchy itself had also been transformed. The death of John and the accession of Henry III, guided by the regency of William Marshall, demonstrated that the crown could survive crisis through careful leadership, negotiation, and compromise. Monarchical authority was no longer exercised solely through fear or coercion. Legitimacy now depended on trust, strategic alliances, and the recognition of noble and civic interests. The barons and nobility, too, emerged transformed. The war had shown them the power of unity, the consequences of rebellion, and the necessity of balancing ambition with pragmatism. They gained a more formalized voice in governance, understanding that loyalty and negotiation could achieve stability more effectively than conflict. Even the broader society felt the transformation. Towns rebuilt, trade recovered, and communities adapted to the lessons of wartime devastation. England had endured civil war, foreign intrusion, and political upheaval, but it emerged stronger, more law-bound, and more conscious of the delicate equilibrium that would define its future. The kingdom was forever changed, a nation forged in the fires of rebellion and tempered by the enduring principles of governance. The First Civil War had made one lesson painfully clear. Unchecked power could destroy a kingdom. King John's reign had been defined by arbitrary rule, heavy taxation, and cruelty, which had ignited rebellion and nearly toppled the monarchy. In its aftermath, the principle that even a king was bound by law became a defining feature of English governance, forever altering the balance between ruler and ruled. Magna Carta, initially sealed in 1215 and reaffirmed after the war, embodied this principle. It established that the king could not act with complete freedom. He was subject to the law and accountable to his barons. Taxes could not be levied without consent. Justice had to be fairly administered, and the rights of nobles and, by extension, towns and communities were recognized. In essence, the monarchy was no longer absolute. Power was constrained by legal frameworks designed to prevent the abuses that had sparked rebellion. The enforcement of these principles required vigilance and competent leadership. William Marshall, regent for the young Henry III, understood that authority depended on respect for law as much as on military might. By reconciling rebellious barons, protecting their rights, and reaffirming agreements, he ensured that the monarchy could survive without relying solely on fear or coercion. The king's power was now balanced, limited, and bound by legal and political precedent. This shift resonated throughout England. Nobles learned that loyalty could be negotiated and enforced through law rather than solely by force. Towns and communities began to expect a degree of legal protection, and the monarchy, though still powerful, recognized the consequences of overreach. The First Civil War had demonstrated that authority alone could not secure stability. Law was essential. England emerged from the conflict with a new understanding. Power without accountability was fragile, but when bound by law, it could endure and even thrive through generations of governance. England's First Civil War was not only a struggle over the throne, it was a battle for rights, justice, and the very framework of governance. The rebellion of the barons against King John revealed that power unrestrained by law could provoke widespread resistance, while the eventual resolution demonstrated that compromise could transform conflict into lasting principles of liberty. From the chaos of rebellion emerged a clearer recognition of rights, not just for nobles, but as a foundation for the broader governance of the kingdom. The reaffirmation of Magna Carta after the war became the symbol and tool of this transformation. What had begun as a list of baronial demands under King John evolved into a framework that limited monarchical power, guaranteed legal protections, and established the idea that even the king must respect law and custom. It formalized the principle that authority was not absolute and that governance required negotiation, consent, and accountability. William Marshall's regency played a crucial role in translating these principles into practice. By negotiating with former rebels, granting pardons, and carefully balancing the interests of the crown and barons, Marshall ensured that England did not collapse under lingering resentment. Reconciliation replaced revenge, and stability became the priority. Castles were returned, towns pledged loyalty, and governance began to function on the basis of negotiated rights rather than fear. The Civil War thus created a shift from rebellion to rights. The lessons were clear. Rebellion could enforce change, but lasting peace depended on recognition of legitimate grievances and structured limits on power. England emerged with a monarchy tempered by law, a nobility empowered yet accountable, and a precedent that authority should coexist with rights. From the ashes of conflict, the kingdom took its first steps toward a system of governance in which law, negotiation, and respect for rights became central pillars, a legacy that would endure for centuries.
England's first civil war, fought between King John, rebellious barons, and the French Prince Louis, was more than a series of battles. It was a transformative event that reshaped the kingdom's political, legal, and social landscape. The conflict exposed the weaknesses of absolute monarchy, the dangers of unchecked power, and the consequences of rebellion, leaving a legacy that would define the course of English history for centuries. The war demonstrated that kings could be challenged when they ruled unjustly. John's tyranny, arbitrary taxation, harsh punishments, and disregard for noble privileges ignited a rebellion that drew support from both barons and foreign powers. The uprising showed that authority without accountability was fragile, and that the loyalty of the kingdom's elite depended on fairness and respect. Magna Carta, initially a reaction to John's abuses, became the enduring symbol of change. Reissued under the young Henry III, it institutionalized limits on royal authority, guaranteed the rights of barons, and introduced the concept that even the king was subject to law. The charter's survival through rebellion and civil war transformed it from a temporary compromise into a cornerstone of constitutional governance. Military and diplomatic leadership proved equally vital. William Marshall's guidance as regent demonstrated that strategic wisdom, negotiation, and reconciliation could stabilize a kingdom in crisis. By restoring loyalty, protecting baronial rights, and securing the monarchy, Marshall ensured that England could recover from the chaos and devastation of war. The First Civil War ultimately changed England forever. Authority was tempered by law, rebellion was balanced by compromise, and governance required negotiation as much as force. The kingdom emerged with stronger institutions, a monarchy aware of limits, and a precedent for rights that would echo through generations. What began as a struggle for power became a defining moment, laying the foundation for the rule of law and shaping the future of English governance in ways that would endure long after the last battle was fought. The First Civil War had ended, leaving England battered yet unbroken. Years of rebellion, foreign intervention, and the tyranny of King John had tested the kingdom's strength and resilience. Castles lay in ruins, towns had suffered, and countless lives had been lost. Yet from this devastation emerged a new England, one tempered by conflict, shaped by compromise, and guided by the enduring principle that law must govern power. The young Henry III, now secure on the throne,
inherited a kingdom poised for recovery. Under the wise stewardship of William Marshal and subsequent regents, the monarchy regained stability. Barons reconciled with the crown, towns rebuilt their walls and markets, and the reaffirmation of Magna Carta established a precedent that even kings were not above the law. England had learned that authority, tempered by accountability and negotiation, could endure even the darkest crises. The legacy of the First Civil War was profound. It demonstrated that rebellion could lead to meaningful change, that leadership required both strength and wisdom, and that governance demanded a careful balance between the king's authority and the rights of his people. The kingdom had endured a trial by fire and emerged stronger, more unified, and aware of the responsibilities of both ruler and ruled. As the sun set over a recovering England, the landscape, once scarred by siege and battle, now reflected hope and resilience. From chaos arose a foundation for law, loyalty, and lasting governance, ensuring that the lessons of rebellion would guide the nation for generations to come. If you enjoyed this journey through England's First Civil War, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to support more historical storytelling and to follow the untold stories that shaped our world.